Let me jump in on this. In the Great Depression, we also see quite a bit of expansion in heavy industry, and it's these higher order stages that do indeed get hit harder than the consumer goods stages. Like I mean, any economic historian acknowledges that about the 1920s and into the Depression. But now Joe Salerno wrote a paper a few years ago looking once again at maybe neglected aspects of Mises' version of the Austrian theory of the business cycle to account for the situation we're in now. Because a lot of times I think when we talk about Austrian business cycle theory, we say that what happens during the boom is there's what we refer to as a lengthening of the structure of production, and see that the higher order states of production get expanded. But
Hmm.
in this case, we do see that. But on the other hand, we also have it's true that those higher order stages are taking a big hit. But aren't retail stores taking a really big hit as well? I mean, there are major chains that have gone completely under as a result of this downturn. We've got just now part of that has to do with the fact that people are doing a lot more shopping online, but that's not the entire story. So how can the Austrian theory account both for the problems in the higher order stages and also for the fact that restaurants and other places that cater to the consumer are also suffering really badly? What's the mechanism there?
Yeah, that's excellent excellent point in that article. Again, highly recommended by Joe, and he's building on this point that Mises made in Human Action, talking about the business cycle, where he tells us that the business cycle is malinvestment of the capital and overconsumption. And the mechanism for this overconsumption is not, well, there are two mechanisms. One is that interest rates, when interest rates are suppressed, all interest rate sensitive goods have an increase in demand. And this includes interest rate sensitive consumer goods. That's why boom lines are almost always in automobiles and housing and so on. But the other thing that Joe was pointing out in his article is that there is a wealth effect. And so, we hear the stories during the housing boom of how people who owned houses before the boom started and then saw their housing prices rise with the general asset price boom in housing would start to use their houses as ATM machines. They would take out second mortgages, and they would take big expensive vacations, and they would eat a lot of restaurant food. And so it was a big increase in demand for these ancillary consumer goods. And as Mises points out, this too is part of the normal part of the boom. We get over consumption along with the malinvestment. We saw this also in the Roaring Twenties. They don't call it the Roaring Twenties for nothing. It was a period of sort of gaiety and excessive consumption in various lines, and then the buildup of these retail distribution processes collapse in the bust when the asset prices collapse and the wealth is destroyed.
We do really good text questions that have been submitted. I'm going to do the second one first. Jeff, I know in addition to the economics courses you teach at Grove City, you also teach American economic history. Somebody wants to know, what are the main differences between the national banks of the 19th century and the central bank of 1913? And of course, an interesting follow-up would be, what is the difference, or what are the differences between the central bank of 1913 and the central bank of 2014? Because of course that has changed dramatically. It did not have a mandate to steer the economy in any sort of direction in 1913. Didn't have the so-called dual eye on price inflation and unemployment and output and all that stuff. That comes much later. But let's stick to the text of the question here. What
Sure.
are I mean, the national banks of the 19th century are far more modest in what it is that they're equipped to do.
Right. Right. Yeah. Again, there's a great article on this. Murray Rothbard has a great article on the history of money and banking, where he points out that there is a certain dynamic that praxeological reasoning can trace out for government intervention in banking. And so the early intervention in banking is that there's a legal privilege created for banks to issue fiduciary media. And it may be that in this country, like in America in the 19th century, we were even on a gold standard. So each bank would hold its own gold reserve, and then issue fiduciary media, checking accounts partially unbacked by gold on top of that reserve. And what you would find, of course, is that some banks would be more profligate than others. And when one group of banks would be more profligate, they'd set in motion these little mini booms in asset prices, and you'd have periodic bank panics where the other banks would be affected because their asset portfolio also includes these same assets whose prices are being bid up by these more profligate bank lending banks, and then those banks would collapse. And in order to provide some protection against the collapse, the banks began to form clearinghouses by which they would pool their reserves. And so this was the first step in the dynamic. And the more profligate banks would be bailed out by a pool of reserve provided by all the consumer banks. And this, of course, then created moral hazard. So if banks know they're going to be bailed out, then they just push their reserve down lower, and the expansion becomes worse, and the panics become more prevalent, and so on. And so eventually you get the government cartelizing things, and so we get the National Banking Acts in the 1860s, which provides for an even further inflationary expansion, which is what the Lincoln administration, of course, desired to finance the war. And so after the war, you have this system in place, this national banking system in place, where the banks are all cartelized into, all given, the national banks are given national charters, and the national banks then hold gold reserves and issue their own notes. And these notes are fiduciary, and the notes can be used by the lower tier banks, by other banks, as reserve in the system. And so you get this kind of pyramiding process of expansion. But again, there are tremendous moral hazards involved in a system like this, and the private bailout fund is insufficient, even when it's pooled among a large number of banks, when these financial panics hit. And so the natural dynamic of this is for the banks then to move to a lender of last resort, a government institution as a lender of last resort. And this was the argument that won the day for the erection of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve was supposed to be a lender of last resort and was provide the bailout fund to protect failing banks during these periodic bank panics. They didn't have a mandate, as Tom mentioned, they didn't have a mandate to sort of stabilize the economy or even stabilize the price level. That came later in the 1920s when they began to aim, at least some of their members began to aim at trying to achieve macroeconomics. And so originally they were created for this purpose, just to provide a more effective bailout mechanism for banks that were under distress, where there were bank runs. Milton Friedman, by the way, this is what he fundamentally blames the Fed for in the downturn of 1930-33. He says it wasn't even so much that the Fed allowed the money supply to collapse per se; they permitted the banks to fail en masse, and that collapsed the money supply, and that was the problem. And that was their mandate, not to let the banks fail. And so this was a responsible Friedman thought for this. Now, as Tom pointed out, this mandate grows and grows. So after World War II, the dual mandate for the Fed is put into place, where they're supposed to create macroeconomic conditions for low unemployment and low inflation simultaneously. And then this grows again, and there are various additions to this mandate, so that in the present, the Fed again has a broader mandate to really control financial markets in general. As we've seen, Ben Bernanke, you remember in 2007, went to Congress under Bush and scared the daylights out of the committee, the congressional committee that he testified before, by telling them that if the Fed didn't, they didn't sort of go along with the Fed inflation, the world financial markets would collapse. And so here now we have the Fed in today's age assuming a mandate to support the asset prices of all financial markets in the world. Again, they do this because this is the only way, really, they think this is the primary way to save the banks when they're in distress.
We have a raised hand. I want to get to a text question first, then we'll get to the raised hand. Somebody wants to know, how can we use Austrian economics to answer microeconomic questions, such as why certain jobs have wage X and similar jobs have wage Y?
Okay, so Austrian economics explains wages by the theory of the general theory is called the theory of imputed value, that labor has value imputed to it according to the value of the output it produces. So if a labor service is very productive in terms of its contribution to output, and if the output sells at a very high price, then the labor would command a high wage. And if the labor is not very productive, an hour of it doesn't produce very much of output, and if this output isn't very valuable to consumers, if it sells for a low price, then that labor would command only a low wage.
Okay, let's Jeff. We'll leave you for a moment, and we'll bring up the brave soul who wants to who has a hand. So let's see.
Oh, hey Tom. Hey Jeff. I just wanted your thoughts on
Hello.
the
What
question.
is your question?
Yes. Can you hear me? Yep. All right. That's sorry. Can you hear me now?
I sure can.
All right. Just had to turn on my mic. All right. So
I sure can. Yeah, no problem.
yeah, I was thinking about the concept that I've heard from some progressives about unjust enrichment, which we know exists in our which has existed in American civil law for, I guess, for them. So what is recently progressives have kind of expanded this unjust enrichment to kind of argue for things like the minimum wage, to say if you're picking oranges on the side of the road and you pay the guy $6, and the person that they're working for, Orange Co. or something, makes thousands of dollars selling these oranges, and he's only paying his guy $6 an hour to pick oranges, then is Orange Co. engaging in unjust enrichment, and what's the Austrian view of this?
Okay, let's get Jeff back on here. All right, let's see. We got Jeff Hermer. There we go. Okay.
Right. So this view really ignores the cost structure in an industry. So let's assume, just for the sake of the argument, that this orange company, producing and selling the oranges, paying the worker, this sub-minimum wage. Soon, well, of course, this producer will have other costs, right? He's got transportation costs of the oranges. He has to retail them, and so on and so forth. But let's assume, for the sake of the argument, that he has a big margin between the revenue that he earns from selling the oranges and the current cost structure that he has from paying his workers and from buying the trucks he needs and having the retail stores and paying the electrical bills and paying his accountants and so on and so forth. This additional profit that he earns, of course, means that other entrepreneurs and other capitalists outside his business will also enter into this market. As long as we have a market economy and they're free to do this. The entrepreneurs and the capitalists are always looking for more profitable lines of production. So they'll enter into this market, and as they enter into this market, they'll want to ramp up production. To ramp up production, they'll have to buy the inputs too. When they buy the inputs, these increased demands will bid up the prices. And so the orange picker will be able to command a higher price, or more orange pickers will be able to be employed in this industry. And this will also bid up the price of trucks and gasoline and so on and so forth. And this process of adjustment will occur in the market until the big capitalists are just earning the going rate of return and no more. They do receive large revenues, but their revenues are paid out for their costs. It can't be the case that over time in a market economy you can have big disparities in revenues and costs. The only way the leftists get away with this is they identify one of the costs, right? Just the labor costs, and you know, in particular cases, and say, oh, these rich fat cats are bringing in $100 million in revenue, and they're paying you know, these lousy $6 an hour for. They don't ever say, but they're hiring 200,000 workers, and each of the workers are working 40 hours a week, and so the labor costs are $50 million. They don't ever say that, right? That their revenues are actually dispersed and don't wind up in the hands of the capitalists in the end. If you look at national income accounts and the share of all income that's produced and earned by people in the U.S., the lion's share goes to labor. 60 to 70% goes to labor, and the capitalists receive 5 to 10%. The entrepreneurs about the same amount. So the big rich companies, the shareholders are only getting about 5 to 10% of the total value of all the things that are being produced in that industry. It's just it's lying with statistics really for the lefties to talk, you know, to identify, to say, well, the revenues are hundreds of millions of dollars, and these poor workers are only getting $7 worth of those hundreds of millions.
Jeff, before we go on, can you clarify the distinction between a capitalist and an entrepreneur?
Right. So in economic theory, we treat these terms, we refer to them as functions that people perform in the economy. So the capitalist is making investments. He's supplying capital. He's lending capital funding into the production process. And for this, the capitalist earns a rate of interest. Again, if he could earn exorbitant return from investing in a particular line, then that line would attract other investors, and this process, this dynamic that I pointed out before, would mitigate any excessive return that he earns. And so all the different lines of production in the economy have a tendency to earn the same going rate of interest. Now, the entrepreneur's function is not to provide capital funding, although particular entrepreneurs can do that through self-financing. But the entrepreneurial function is to provide foresight. It's to anticipate what consumer demands will be, and to organize producers in order to satisfy these demands in a cost-effective way. And entrepreneurs who have superior foresight, who see in advance what it is that needs to be produced today in order to satisfy consumers in the future, earn profit, and entrepreneurs who have inferior foresight don't, or even suffer loss.
I'm just letting my wife know that I've spent, not that you guys need to be burdened with this, but I spent most of today doing a hideous bank reconciliation thing for business purposes for taxes for this year, and I was just in a foul mood when I had to go to the post office this afternoon. I was just in a foul mood. I was with somebody. I was denouncing the government and whatever. And obviously, the woman in front of me was a government employee. And normally, I mean, I hope you guys think of me as, reasonably civilized person, whatever. And I was just a monster. And I told my wife the whole night's going to be ruined because I have to finish this thing. Well, I finished it before dinner. My wife was taking a nap because we have a new baby and sleep is intermittent. So I just wanted her to know that when I come home, we can relax. Like I did this hideous thing. All right, you guys didn't need to know that. Let's go on. What about question? I get this once in a while, and Jeff, I wish I had a home run answer. And I know there's somebody out there who has a home run answer. And it has to do with government funding of scientific research and development. And it's the sort of rationale that's given for government. Of course, you need the government to be involved in R&D because it's uncertain and it can be very expensive, and you can't expect the private sector to do it. And they seem to think there's a good track record of it because they'll say, look, the government gave us. It was government research that yielded us this or this or this innovation, like the internet, for example. We'd have no internet if it weren't for government involvement and so on and so forth. Now, part of the answer to that involves the fact there is a literature on this subject of crossover, of spillover effects from government spending on science and then commercial applications from that.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a difference in the literature among what percent of the government expenditure actually turns out to be useful in the civilian world. Because, for example, there's a lot of government research in the military, and we get things like, well, hey, you know, now we got Tang because the government spent some money, and so now we get as a spin-off from it. And the percentage varies by some scholars say it's very low. It's like 5%. Others say it may be 30%. But, of course, you can address the question with the usual what is seen and what is not seen objection, right? That if the government spends it on something, we don't know what individuals would have spent it on. But that seems unsatisfying. If the government really gave us the internet, well, I don't care that you would have spent the money on a rose garden or, you know, on a nice dinner. Who cares, right? You know, to heck with your dinner. I want the internet. And part of the answer to the internet thing is that if you were more technically inclined than I am, a lot of people I've talked to have said, this is the classic example of really any innovation always has some government hand in it because governments are so large these days. And these all wind up being cases of things that obviously would have developed on their own. And so the government tries to, but they obviously would have developed on their own. And moreover, I would also add that in let's say 1870, imagine if we had conceived of the idea of an iPod in 1870. We conceived of the idea of it, and we said, you know what? If we just pull together, there's nothing we can't do, right? We're Americans. There's nothing we can't do. So we're going to tax you, you know, at 85%. And we're not going to spend money on anything except iPod research. You might have been able to get the iPod in 1870 at the expense of everything in the world else that you valued. In fact, I had somebody raise this with me in a Q&A after a talk I gave, and apparently there was some estimate what it would have cost to produce like an iPod or a TV if we had tried to do it like 150 years ago, and it was just some enormous figure. So maybe it's better to wait until the market is ready. Wait until people are ready voluntarily to give up some resources in exchange for the prospect of future consumer products.
Yeah.
So that was a very meandering sort of reply. What do you say, Jeff? And is there a good? I know Peter Klein is pretty good on this, but do we have somebody who's just dynamite on this?
Yeah, like you say, it's mostly we're hitting singles and I guess, and not home runs. But I think you put your finger on it there. You put your finger there, I think, on the main issue at the end. You know, people tend to judge these things too much on technical terms. You mentioned the 1870s. Well, the big government subsidized project in the 1870s, of course, were the railroads, and as we know, the transcontinentals, and of course we know that these didn't work out. Most of them went bankrupt and had to be reorganized, and there was a lot of malinvestment and so on and so forth. And historians tend to respond to this obvious failure of these government programs by saying, well, they were just built in advance. They were built too soon, and it was too much building too soon, and you know, technically it's a great idea and we should have done it, and we would eventually have done it anyway, but the government here just got a little bit ahead of itself. But if that is in fact a feature of all investment, if the feature of all investment is its timing, well then again we can see that this has to be integrated into economic calculation like anything else. We can look at all sorts of examples in the modern period that are very similar, like the subsidies for electric cars, the subsidies for alternative energy, and so on. These may be technically adequate means to accomplish an end, but they're not done in a timely fashion precisely because they're economically inefficient. There are just too many resources. It's not that we even have to envision the alternatives. We know that too many resources are being poured into developing these things right now in the present. That's why they have to be subsidized. And so the same argument could be made of R&D. If R&D has to be subsidized, that's positive that that particular R&D project is inefficient. Because if it was efficient, if the timing was right, and if the product it produces was integratable into the capital structure that we have as it is, then entrepreneurs would seize this opportunity because it would be quite profitable, and the asset values would, for the devices that they produce, would be quite valuable.
You know, on the specific question of the internet, the problem with me is I'm just not knowledgeable enough about this stuff. Like, people start talking about it. I saw a discussion thread about this very topic, about government and the internet, and the majority of people were saying, well, look, it's a case of the private sector did this, the government did that. There's no reason the private sector couldn't have also done that, and maybe the internet would be a lot more coherent than it actually turned out to be. But as soon as they get talking technical stuff, it's like it's like how people must feel like when they hear Jeff Herbner talking about the capital structure when they don't even know what Austrian economics is. You know, like I don't even know what in the world is happening here.
Right.
So I wish I did, and I wish I had time to be not so backward. You know, like gosh, just something else. All right, let's go now back to the raised hand feature. Another brave soul, and look, we're so generous here. Imagine if this were like a law school class, you know, where you get up on the screen and the professor grills you. No one would want to do it. But we're all so nice and gentle. Now there's practically a queue that's been established here. Okay, let's go to Brad, and then Jeff will talk to you in a minute.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. I appreciate it. My question, I want to state my question and then try to define it. Yes, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Maybe you can't hear me.
I sure can. Sorry, there's a long lag.
Sorry.
Nope.
So, my question is, do Austrians recognize the distortions that happen through central planning deception? That's my question. Now, let me try to explain it. When I read your book, Meltdown, I read your book, Meltdown, and you lived through that, I would assume that you might say there's more manipulation today than during that time period. And what I'm thinking is, if without interference, if 1 + 1 = 2, but today we have central planners aggressively changing data, manipulating information, trying to deceive the public, how do we deal with that as Austrians, other than to say, you just can't do it forever, eventually something's going to go wrong? I mean, is there any consideration given to how much people are influenced by central planners actively at work trying to deceive people so that the general theory of Austrian economics isn't playing out the way we would expect, because we're assuming, in a sense, that there was a greater fairness in the playing field?
Okay, can you give a specific, even a hypothetical example of this phenomenon that you have in mind?
Yeah. Let's take the FDIC, for example. So I have a congressional hearing from, I think it's maybe February of 2000, where the former chairman is saying the FDIC is an imaginary fund. He actually told the congressional hearing, we should just call this taxes and not fees, and through a unified budget, all of the FDIC money is spent and it's simply full of IOUs. So when I discuss that with even bankers, very few people understand that reality. When I discuss it with PhD Austrian economists, very few people understand, that is what exists. So there's a level of trust that we have in the banking system that is more through ignorance than true understanding. And so even tonight, when Jeff referred to, a reserve fund, it doesn't exist. And so certain things that we might expect would happen if people truly understood the way the environment isn't happening. Not because,
okay, I understand the question. Yeah, okay, yeah, I've got it. All right, yeah, let's see what Jeff has to say about that. Thank you, Brad. Jeff, let's come on back and let's do this. And again, I want your feedback. Do you guys like this? I think this is neat. So I want to get your feedback. Share that with us at on Facebook, facebook.com/Liberty Classroom. Jeff, let's hear from you.
Right. Well, Yeah, certainly this is a problem. I don't think it's true, generally speaking, that Austrian economists ignore the possibility that the government is engaged in acts of deliberate manipulation, and that this influences the way people behave. This fact about the FDIC has been known for a long time, long before the congressional testimony where the FDIC funds had been exhausted by various payouts. It's been known ever since the beginning, in fact, by economists who paid attention, that the FDIC fund basically had about 1% assets against what it was insuring, all of the checkable deposits in the country. So so I don't think, you know, that it is true that the average customer, the average bank customer, is misled by this, but I don't think the average banker is. The average banker isn't relying upon the FDIC for direct funding. I mean, he only gets funding from the FDIC if he goes bankrupt. If he's going to get a bailout fund, he's relying on the Fed. And the Fed isn't constrained by any sort of congressional funding or, you know, balance sheet consideration. They can just print money, issue money, and expand their balance sheet, as we've seen, ad infinitum. And they can just buy assets from banks at whatever price they wish to pay and bail them out completely. So I don't think the head of Goldman Sachs or J.P. Morgan is under any delusion with respect to what the federal government is doing. But your point's well taken with respect to the general population. It is just an illusion that created by the state mainly to protect the banks, that they propagandize customers that there's some big fund that the government has to insure their deposits. And people that and this does in fact create moral hazard and worse problems in the banking system. So I'm not sure that every instance, at least, of things like that, that economists have not taken those facts into consideration. I think in some cases we have. Maybe there are other cases, certainly where we have not, or we've underappreciated these deliberate manipulations on the part of politicians and bureaucrats.
Okay, I think this is a very, very clever question. Nathan asks, strictly speaking, are we making a normative statement when we use the term free market economics? Now, let me just explain. When you're doing economics, one of the things they'll introduce you to is the distinction between statements and positive statements. So a positive statement might be that a price control above the market clearing level will lead to shortages. A normative statement would be price controls therefore are bad. So a positive statement simply describes what the consequences are, but a normative statement is value laden. Are we inserting values right off the bat into our discussion when we use the term free market?
Well, I mean, it could. I would say that if we do this, we only do it.
Or a whole array of property related. For instance, or could that just be purely descriptive, and we're not necessarily endorsing those property relations?
I think that's a correct view. I don't think there's any intention to make normative assertions when using a term like the free market. I think this can be, and I think the intention of Austrian economists is to use this as a descriptive account of a particular kind of economy. Again, we could use the word capitalism to refer to the same thing. You know, Mises preferred the phrase the unhampered market economy. And so that would be a synonym, and which presumably would have no ethical connotation to it. But you're right, this could be misunderstood by non-economists to infer a particular ethical claim. And in fact, this is probably why Bill Clinton, back in the 1990s, or who was president back in the 1990s, used to say that his policies were giving us this wonderful free market. Look at all the great prosperity that you're getting under my administration, because we're advancing the free market economy. And so he was definitely using this in a normative sense. It's a wonderful thing to be free, and we have a positive ethical attachment to liberty and so on. But but I think it's safe to say that as economists, our intention at least is to use this term in just a descriptive way. And if it is problematic, I think we should switch terms and just call this, again, Mises would prefer to call this just the market economy, or more precisely the unhampered market economy. And I think that would be fine with Austrian economists if we use this terminology and drop the free market language, especially if it has these normative overtones.
Okay, I may bypass the question about a private law system because I'm planning to talk to Bob Murphy about that on my program next week. I can't imagine there's anybody in this room who doesn't know I have a podcast at this point, but you can check it out at tomwoodsradio.com, and there are links there to subscribe on iTunes and so on and so forth. So I suggest doing that, and we're gonna talk to him. I'll probably have Michael Humer back on to talk about the second half of his book, The Problem of Political Authority, where he delves into that question of the purely voluntary society. So just because I don't think either one of us is a specialist in this, although Joe knows everything about everything, so I hesitate to say that. But so I don't want you to think we're just evading your question. I'm going to take that question head on when I talk to Bobby next week. Okay, we've got, let's see. Somebody, people asking about a hard money standard. I want to refer you to a couple of links. Now, one thing, maybe I'll have to ask the Shindig people, but in the old model, we had a chat window for everybody simultaneously. Now, you guys can start chats with each other privately and have group chats, but I used to be able to put links up. But tomwoods.com/money links to congressional testimony about how a private money system would work. It's glorious to me that ever occurred, because 100 years from now, people are going to look in the congressional record. They're going to say, somebody delivered these remarks in Congress? Who is this Jeffrey Herbener? There are going to be busts of Herbener all around in response to this. So tomwoods.com/money I recommend. And then also, if you're interested in the gold standard and different pathways that have been recommended by economists to returning to that, if that's what you want, then Google the following phrase in quotation marks, how to return to gold. And that will bring up a blog post of mine from about 5 years ago, but where in one place I link to various different proposals. Rothbard's proposal, Henry Hazlitt, George Reisman, and I'm sure 2 or 3 others. Okay, let's go back. We've got 10 more minutes. Let's use this camera feature as long as we've got it. We've got 2 people with raised hands, so let's go to just choose one at random, flip a coin, Michael, and bring one of them up for us. Keith, hello. Well, unfortunately, I can't hear you. You'll have to test your microphone. They have a little way to do it. You see if the bars are lighting up, then you know that your microphone is working. But unfortunately, I can't hear you. But we'll try and get back to you if you can get your mic working. Send a note in the Ask a Question button. Use the Ask a Question button to tell us that the mic is up and running. But we're going to have to go to the other guy. And by guy, I mean that inclusively, of course.
Is the sound working?
Alex, hello.
Hi. Am I coming
Yeah.
through? Okay. Thanks for taking my question. Relating a little bit to what you were just mentioning about the gold standard and currencies, I think most of us are aware that before 1913, the U.S. was on a gold standard with private banks also issuing versions of their own currencies. But I think for most of us living in the present era, how that worked in practice is very difficult to understand. So I'm just wondering if you can speak about how the federal system related to the private money system and how that interfaced.
Okay, let's pop Jeff back on here. Thanks for your question, by the way. Jeff,
Okay, well,
what do you say?
maybe I'm not following the train of the question, but since he was talking about how the system would function, as opposed to say the way it did in the 19th century, let me just describe that, and then maybe you can clarify if I'm misdirecting my answer. But if we went back to a gold standard today, or if we had a gold standard that just sort of had developed and been left alone by the state, and we had a gold standard, the way that I would exist today is that we would have a private enterprise, of course, producing gold coins, and their production then would be integrated, just like the production of everything else, into the economic calculations of entrepreneurs. So the minting companies would produce more gold if it were more profitable, and less gold if it were less profitable, and so on. So that would not be particularly problematic. What would be, or different, but what would be quite different, I think, from the way things were configured in the 19th century, is that our money substitutes that banks provide for us would probably not be banknotes. A fairly expensive way of producing claims to money. There would probably be checking accounts, just like we have today, except that these checking accounts would be backed by a reserve of money of 100%. And so for most of us who use the money substitutes in our exchanges, most of us use our bank account funds more readily than we do cash. We would be doing the same thing. We'd still have checking accounts at banks. We'd still swipe our debit cards. We'd still write checks, transfer funds this way. We'd still get paid with checks, wire transfers, and so on. I don't think there would be difference in that respect, unless something like a peer-to-peer transfer system would develop. But and so the way it would operate for the average person, I think, would be quite easy to describe, or at least it isn't hard to imagine the way in which it would function as compared to the way that it functioned for the average citizen, say, back in 1890.
We've got a bunch more questions. There are two in particular that I want to try to get to before we run out of time. Before I do that, I want to tell you guys, in case you don't know already, that you know, I sent an email, I think. So if you read the email, you probably got it. But so you know about courses that are coming up in the next few months. But the one that Jeff is doing for later this year is just so important, because if you are studying economics in a college classroom, you are going to be confronted with a lot of concepts that will not be addressed or refuted or analyzed in the typical Austrian treatises, and for a variety of reasons. And so you may wonder, well, I wonder what an Austrian would think about this that I'm reading in my economics book, or how would an Austrian conceive of that, or what does an Austrian think about this diagrammatic scheme? And I'm going to take the Paul Samuelson, the Samuelson-Nordhaus text that has the key textbook in post-war America teaching economics, and he's going to go through it chapter by chapter and review with you the concepts being introduced and the merits or demerits of those concepts. I mean, as I said, there's never been anything like this before. No one's ever done anything like this from an Austrian point of view. So I hope you'll stick around for that course, because I think that's going to be really, really valuable. Okay, so two questions. Let's try to be, even at the expense of precision, sort of brief, so we can fit them both in. The first one, I'll tell them both. You can pace yourself. The first question is, what is the Austrian view of institutions such as the IMF? Does it create similar effects to central banks on a global scale? That would be the first question. And the second question is one that we get quite a bit. How is it, with all of the debt monetization occurring presently, that inflationary effects are not as evident as the money supply increase? So first is the IMF question, and secondly, why aren't we seeing price inflation? Can you knock those out in 4 minutes, Jeff Herbener?
We'll see. The IMF, I don't think, is it functions like an international central bank, and so I don't think the IMF is the international business cycles. The IMF it does, however, influence and intervene in various international arrangements. And the main thing, of course, that they do is they try to come in after the fact, after the Fed has inflated or some central bank has inflated, and this inflation has had international repercussions. They tend to come in after the fact to bail out Western banking interests who have malinvested, made bad investments in countries. And they do this by providing bailout funds to the foreign country, and then these funds, of course, are repaid to American banks, and that's where the bailout comes. And then they impose restrictions, monetary and fiscal restrictions on different countries, so that these excesses that the various countries have engaged in could be moderated in the future, and that the investment field will be less volatile for the big American banking interests who have been involved in this international credit expansion into these different countries. Second question on the reason why we don't see very much price inflation currently. There are two things going on. And the first is that the banks themselves are attempting to put their balance sheets back in order. And so the QEs that the Fed has been engaged in have been intentionally designed by the Fed to take the bad loans off the banks of the books and to replace these bad loans with the most liquid assets that exist, cash and claims to cash in the deposits of the Fed. And so this is precisely what the banks need to shore up their balance sheets. They need to offload their questionable debt. They've sold over $1 trillion worth of mortgage-backed securities to the Fed, and to increase their liquidity. And in this climate that exists currently, in this investing climate that exists currently, the banks are not eager to lend. The Fed is paying interest on their reserves, and they're happy just to sit on this liquid asset and be paid even a minuscule interest payment by the Fed, as opposed to starting the lending, regenerating the supply of lending. So the supply of lending is being constrained both by the bank's desire to shore up their balance sheets and by the lack of demand for investment projects. So the real problem of this downturn, like in most cases, is the lack of investment. And that comes from the lack of investors who are borrowing funds because they are uncertain about the future configuration of government activity, and they're not willing to normalize their investment patterns anymore. The thing that's going on is that there's a general increase in money demand. So it's not just the banks who are absorbing a lot of this liquidity, but we've read stories over the past several years about large businesses building up these huge cash hoards. Apple Inc., for example, has even been chided in the mainstream press for holding on to hundreds of billions of dollars in cash. So again, in downturns, it's typically a good strategy to convert assets to a more liquid form. Cash is king, as they say in the downturn. And so when the demand for money increases, then it's being held by people instead of being used to demand goods and services, and therefore it moderates price inflation. Of course, this is also the big fear, that the future that we face in the near future will be much more inflationary. The potential for a very aggressive inflation in prices is now built into the system. The banks have well over 100% reserves, these cash reserves in the system, on which they can start to issue fiduciary media and expand the money supply, the broader. and money demand will eventually normalize again. And when this happens, this means simply that people will be demanding goods more heavily. We see this a little bit now in markets. Housing markets have rebounded in certain places. Silicon Valley, San Francisco, New York City. The housing markets are booming again. And so there's some indication that this process of normalization is coming back.
And with that, we're going to bring it to a close. I want to thank Jeff Herbener for being with us tonight, and I'm glad to Q&A. I'm going to try to. April's a little bit of a tricky month with Easter for me, and quite a bit of travel next week. But I'm going to make you guys whole. We're going to make up for any sessions that we missed as we've been searching for a suitable platform. So we'll probably do at least one more in April, and then we'll do a couple more maybe at the very beginning of May to equalize everything for you guys. But I want to thank Michael for helping us tonight and feeding me the questions and helping us ease our way into this. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, I'd like your feedback on the Facebook page, which I'll try and use a little bit more often, facebook.com/classroom, if you liked this or not. If you didn't like this, I'll be kind of surprised. Now, but I do want to know. So, Jeff, thanks. We'll have to have you back on the program sometime soon. That was a great chat we had today. You can check that out at it's the most recent episode at tomwoodradio.com. And I really enjoyed seeing you in your natural habitat at Grove City College when I was there for the conference a couple months ago. And I'm devastated that I couldn't the Mises Institute Scholarly Conference this year, but we did get a new baby out of it. So, you know, the balance sheet comes up looking pretty good, I think. So,
Right.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, everybody, especially you brave soul on camera. That's really terrific. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Tom.
I don't know how to X out of it. I think the administrator does that. You can X me out now.